And let me mark Christiana here. Now, Christiana, you don't have to be here today because you're graduating.
Oh, looky there.
But you know what? This is
That's not what you get up.
This is easier. This is easier than watching the video, right?
Right.
Okay, so you still have a couple of videos. You got my email?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah.
you still
and I
have
did
some
watch them, and I sent you
videos to watch.
Yeah.
But your attendance only goes up through the 3rd because technically graduating students don't have to attend class this week.
Oh,
So
that's so cool.
So by attending today, you've made up for one of those absences
Okay, cool.
from the past. First, I want to say, I'm enjoying reading your papers. You people have picked such interesting topics to write about, and you're doing a great job writing your papers. Chapter 12 talks about paths to economic growth. It says here on page 467, in 2003, IBM had 9,000 employees in India. By 2009, they had 74,000 employees in India. Why would IBM be shipping all of these jobs over to India? The people in India are saying what? Great, we have all these jobs now. The people in America who used to work for IBM, who I suppose, does anyone know an IBM worker who got caught in that move where they said, IBM said, we're moving this operation to India. If you want to keep your job, you can move to India.
I know several people work.
If they would have said that to you, what would be your response? I think I'll find a different job. Would it? Or would you pack up and move to India?
I don't know. India sounds cool.
What if they said, oh, we don't pay as much in India as we do here in the United States, so you'll have to take a pay cut?
Oh, that'll depend.
Well, isn't like cost of living lower over there, so wouldn't it be that much of a difference?
Yes, the cost of living is lower in India. So,
Hey, I'd go.
and some of the things that you enjoy here might not be available in India. You might have to put up with a few creature comfort adjustments. Do any of you know someone who had a company that offered them a job to transfer to California, and they were going to give them a huge raise if they moved to California? Have any of you lived in California?
No.
I have.
Why would they offer a person a substantial raise to move to California?
Because the cost of living is really high.
And I said to this guy who told me that, I said, before you say yes to that promotion, they called it a promotion, I said, you better check to see what it's going to cost you to rent an apartment in California, and to drive a car in California, and to buy groceries in California. And he came back and said, oh, I'm glad you told me to check that out, because I put a pencil to it, and by the time I was finished, all of my salary increase was going to be eaten up in the additional cost of living to live in California. But the people in California are saying, hey, come on out here, because that gives us economic growth. Does anyone know where companies, okay, IBM moved some people to India. In 2017, it was up to 131,000 employees in India that IBM had moved to India. Yes?
What's IBM?
International Business Machines. It's like a computer service company. And basically, a whole bunch of companies were moving jobs overseas for economic reasons. The tax rate was better over there. They could hire employees cheaper overseas. Some of the companies who did that have any of you had a person from India call you representing a company and try to sell you something? Have you, Joshua?
Oh, yeah, it's I get really irritated when that happens. They try to imitate like Microsoft or something, and they try to sell me something, and it's just like, come on.
And do they speak English with a different accent?
Yeah. Come
and
on.
Are some of them even hard to understand?
Yeah.
And the ones you can understand often speak English with a British accent because they used to be a British colony, and that's understandable. But sometimes I've had to say to some people, I'm sorry, but I do not understand what you're saying. And hopefully they realize they need to go work on their English speaking skills if they're going to call people in the Midwest to try to sell them something from overseas. But the companies overseas, that's their path to economic growth. Yes?
Someone once called our house to try to sell something, and I answered it in another language, and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry."
Oh, what language did you answer in?
Portuguese Creole, it's not common.
Okay, now that's a good idea. That's a good idea. I should learn some.
You should what you should do is if they try to sell you something, you should try to sell them something back.
It says here on page 467, the first jobs to leave the United States and other rich countries, wealthy countries, were blue-collar factory jobs. You know what a blue-collar factory job is? Why do they call it blue-collar? White-collar would be the people who work in management and in banking and in investments because they wear white shirts. Blue-collar would be people who wear gray or blue or tan uniforms because they get a little dirty once in a while. But the first jobs to leave America were blue-collar jobs. And then white-collar jobs started to leave. And now service sector jobs are going overseas. And it says 3 million service jobs are expected to leave the United States by 2015, including half of the jobs in packaged software and information technology services. Now, what do the other countries say where this stuff is moving? Hey, that's our path to economic growth. What are people saying here in the United States about this? We're losing jobs to overseas, to other countries, because we're not making it easy or profitable for companies to stay here in the United States and do business here. And part of that had to do with taxation. Part of it had to do with what you have to pay for employees and how much cheaper you can hire labor in other countries. Once we changed the tax rate for corporations, some corporations have come back to the United States to do business. And some manufacturers have decided to stay in America. I don't know if you realize this, but when Sam Walton first started building Walmarts all over America, he had a big banner that he put up in his store, and it said, "Made in America." And he said, most of the stuff in our store is made in America. We don't buy from overseas suppliers unless the product isn't available here in the United States. And Walmart was a booming success in America. And some people say it was because Sam Walton took that approach. Even if he had to pay more for the product to be made in America, and even if his margin of profit was smaller, he still said he felt like this is the best way to grow the American economy and to grow my business. Now, if you go into a Walmart and look for a product that says made in America, you'll be hard pressed to find one because most of the stuff is made overseas. One of the benefits of, right now, have you read in the news that we sent some battleships through near Taiwan to let China know that you can't push Taiwan around? Have any of you been reading anything in the news about some of the struggles that our government has been having politically with some other governments? Well, while the governments are having these little flare-ups with relationships with each other, we're still getting, have you seen these big containers that come over here on ships? We're getting containers. Gotcha, Adrian and Drake. We're getting these containers coming over here from China where all this stuff that we're buying in the store is made in China. And I'm thinking that that's good for Chinese relationships. I mean, if China is making a lot of money from selling stuff to America, I don't think China wants to jeopardize their business relationship with America over Taiwan or any other, or where they're putting where they're actually building islands to expand their borders. I think that we've probably done ourselves a service by doing business with all of these countries. For sure, we do ourselves a service by buying oil from all of these oil-rich countries because they become our friends. Friends to the point that, does anyone remember reading about a war in the Middle East where Iraq invaded Kuwait? Do any of you remember reading about that? Iraq decided that Kuwait, being an oil-rich country, wasn't very powerful. So they just mobilized their army in the middle of the night, invaded Kuwait, and took over all of their oil fields. And the Kuwaiti government, who sells us a lot of oil, called America and said, Iraq has just invaded and taken over our oil fields. Can you help us? And any idea what America's president said? We will be right there with a shipload of soldiers to take your oil fields back and give them back to you. And the ships and the airplanes went over there, and within about a matter of 3 or 4 days, all of the Iraqi soldiers, when they saw this huge army of American soldiers arriving in Kuwait, the Iraqi soldiers said, whoa, we're out of here. I guess they didn't think America would do that, and they took off and went back to Iraq. But on the way back to Iraq, they thought, we will destroy the oil industry in Kuwait by lighting torches, fires to all their oil wells. And so they took the oil wells and set them on fire. So after the American soldiers drove them out of Kuwait and helped secure the border to make Kuwait safe, guess what happened? The oil firefighters from Texas flew over to Kuwait and just went from oil well to oil well, putting the fires out and restoring the Kuwaiti oil business so they could sell oil to America again. So Kuwaiti's path to economic growth was selling oil to America. America's path to economic growth, keeping oil cheap, is buying it from Kuwait. Iraq invades and we drive them out. And then once we drive them out, Iraq gets very upset because we have made them look foolish. So, anyone know what happened? Some terrorist from Iraq blew up the World Trade Center building in New York City. And does anyone know what we did as a result of that? We invaded Iraq and basically took over. You guys might want to every now and then check out what's going on around the world and see what kind of struggles countries are having with each other, and ask yourself, how is that affecting the path to economic growth for these countries? On page 468, it talks about analyzing and comparing countries' economies. What kind of economy were we in the 1800s? Anyone know what kind of economy we were? The Homestead Act. Every family has a 160-acre farm. What kind of economy would that make us?
Farming.
An agricultural economy, a farming economy. What happened when Henry Ford decided to build a car that could be sold cheap enough that everyone in America could own one, and he opened up a plant in, was it Detroit, Michigan, where they made Ford motor cars, and his idea was mass produce these things so anyone who works here can afford to buy one when it comes off the end of the assembly line. And that caught on, and everybody wanted to own a car, and then Ford makes them, so who else decides to make cars? Chevrolet, Packard, Studebaker. Have you heard of Packards and Studebakers? They didn't last very long. You know about Fords and Chevrolets, right? And Cadillacs and Pontiacs. Those companies stayed around, and in a sense, that's when we became like an industrialized economy. Industrialization kind of took over in America. And why would young people leave the farming community, agricultural economy, and move to town? Because they could get a better paying job working in some kind of industry. And what kind of industry are any of you planning to work in some kind of industry? Are any of you planning in the future to be a farmer, to work in agriculture? Are any of you planning to work in an auto plant? There's two of them in Kansas City. There's a Ford plant and a General Motors plant. Any of you plan to go to work building Fords or Chevrolets? So, what other industries are there in Kansas City? What else do we build here besides cars and trucks? Are you planning to work in a service industry? You go, what's the service industry? Does anyone know that the U.S. government is one of the largest employers in Kansas City? Anybody thinking about working for the U.S. government someday? Applying for a government job?
Cool.
Is anybody planning to work? Okay, you understand where that's called the service sector when they talk about the different sectors of work? that's a service sector where you serve the government and you serve the people. Is anyone planning to work in the construction industry? Is anyone planning to work in the educational industry? Any of you planning to be teachers? Okay, that's service because you're serving people's children. That's a service industry. You don't have any plans. You just planning to go to school and get a degree and then do something afterwards. You don't have any economic plans. When I was in high school, I knew I couldn't be a farmer as much as I enjoyed it. And if I went to the local town to get a job, I worked at an auto parts house, which I enjoyed doing, but I didn't want to do that the rest of my life. And I knew there was a good paying job working at the post office delivering mail, or I could get a job working for the farmers co-op, where they had a big distribution center in town where they shipped farm supplies all over north central Oklahoma. And I have some friends who worked. Oh, and there was also the oil industry. So I had some friends from high school who went to work in the oil industry. And some of them went to work in the, I guess you would call it the steel. Well, my brother worked for a while building propane tanks because people in Oklahoma use propane to heat their house and cook stuff on their stoves. And all those oil derricks that were used to drill oil, somebody had to build them, and there were companies in the town where I lived that built those. I thought about going to work in the oil industry, working on one of those rigs where they go out and drill wells. But then you meet a guy who works on one and he shakes your hand and says, "Welcome to the oil field," and he only has 3 fingers because he lost 2 of them, another finger and a thumb, in an accident on the oil rig. And I'm thinking, if this job takes off your digits, I'm probably not going to do that. I did work at a service station. There's a picture of one of those on page 468. I worked at a service station one time. That was back when have any of you ever pulled into a gas station and somebody came out of the door and said, "May I help you?" And you said, "Yes, I would like to fill my car up with gas." They said, "Oh, we'll do it for you." And you popped the lid and they went back and put the gas in your car and then brought the little credit card thing out for you to sign. Have any of you bought gas like that somewhere? Somebody decided a few years ago that they could sell gas cheaper if they didn't hire someone to go out and pump it for you. And while it was pumping gas, I also would wash the windshield of your car and check the fluids and put windshield washer fluid in and check the oil in your car and that kind of thing, and check your fan belts to see if they were frayed or if they were in good shape. And then if you needed one, we could sell you one. But somebody decided we can sell gasoline cheaper if we go to a self-service gas station. And what's a self-service gas station? That's the one where you pull up to the pump and you get out and pump your own gas. And then when you go inside to pay, they have a restaurant and a candy store and a soda fountain inside at Quick Trip where you can buy lunch and sandwiches and ice cream cones and everything else. Do you know the difference between, on page 468, gross domestic product and gross national income? Any idea what gross domestic product is? Well, look what it says on page 468. It's the total value of all the goods and services produced within a country. So all the stuff that we produce is called GDP. And gross national income is the gross domestic product plus any income that residents receive from foreign investments, minus any money paid out of the country to foreign investors. So we have all this stuff that we produce in America. That's our gross domestic product. Then we add to that the income that people in America receive from foreign investments, and we subtract from that money that foreign investors have invested in America that we pay to people overseas. And you can measure GDP or GNI on the per person basis, per capita, or you can just measure it in terms of the country itself, the total GDI, or GNI or GDP for the country. For most countries, there's little difference between the two statistics, but the difference that exists are important to people in geography. These differences reveal the impact that foreign investment has on a country's economy. I think the richest nation in the world is Luxembourg. And they make most of their wealth from foreign people depositing money in their banks, and they pay interest to them, but they have all this money that they can loan out to other people from around the world and make money from them. So they make most of their wealth from other countries. You can look up on the internet who are the richest countries in the world. But does it surprise you that even if we're not the richest on a per capita basis, we're one of the richest, and a lot of people want to come to America for economic opportunities? Do any of you know somebody who's come here from a foreign country for an economic opportunity? Do you work with them?
No.
Do any of you work someplace where there are people who have come here from Mexico or South America? And do you know them well enough to know that they take a big portion of their paycheck and ship it back to Mexico or South America for their family? When, remember I told you about Red Rack thrift stores on Sunday? They have this 50-cent sale. Well, years ago it used to be 5 for $1. So you could go into the Red Rack thrift store after church on Sunday and buy 5 pairs of shoes for $1, 20 cents a pair. And in this one thrift store that we would stop at after on our way home from church, there would be this couple in there speaking Spanish, which says they're from Central or South America, and they're loading up their cart with shoes. Any idea what have any of you ever gone on a mission trip to Mexico where you take a van or a trailer full of shoes down there and just give them away to people who don't have shoes? I mean, when this guy finds out that he can work here in America and make a decent wage and have all these shoes for 20 cents a pair, he loads up on them, and every once in a while he drives back down to Mexico to visit his friends and takes these shoes to people who can't afford to buy a pair of shoes. And when they say, "Whoa, where'd you get all these shoes?" and they say, watch what he would tell them. People in America don't wear their shoes out. They buy a new pair every year, or 2 or 3, and they donate the old ones to the Red Rack thrift store, and I go in there and buy them for 20 cents a pair and bring them down here for people to wear. And so can you see what people say? What kind of country is this where people don't wear their clothes out? They want to be fashionable, so they go buy new clothes and then donate the old ones to a charity like Red Rack. Red Rack used to be called, does anyone remember what it was called before they changed it to Red Rack? I think it was Veterans Thrift Store. And I told some students, I shopped there, and they said, Dr. Bonine, you're not a veteran. I'm going, no. They said, well, that store is only for veterans. No, they use the money that they make from selling stuff at that store to help veterans. On page 469, it talks about the limitations of G&I and GDP, and the biggest limitation is government statistics. It says in the right-hand column, do not measure activity that is illegal and therefore hidden. Do any of you know anything about hidden income? Have you ever had somebody do something for you and you paid them in cash? And they ask you, this actually happens at McDonald's. I pay cash for something and they say, do you want a receipt? Does anyone know why they ask that?
Because we're demanded to. We have no choice.
Why would the boss tell his employees to ask people if they want a receipt? If I don't get a receipt, does that mean that the hamburger I just bought doesn't show up as something they sold to make a profit?
No,
What?
it still shows up.
It does?
Mm-hmm.
Then why do they ask me if I want a receipt?
Isn't it for tax purposes?
Are
For
they
you.
paying taxes on that sale?
No, for you.
For you.
For me? See, I guess I've just lived long enough in an economy that says some people want to do business where it doesn't show. So when they say, do you want a receipt? I'm assuming they're wanting to know if I'm willing to pay without them having to report the money to the government. So they're, in a sense, hiding their money producing activity from the government, which means they don't report it and they don't pay taxes on it. But maybe that's not what McDonald's is doing. But I always say, yes, I want a receipt. But do you understand that in some countries, in fact, in this country, the other day I pulled into the gas station to buy some gas, and there was a guy sitting in the gas station parking lot with a truck, with one of these vans with the tailgate pushed up, and he was selling tennis shoes out of the back of his van. Did he have a credit card machine there? No, he was selling them for cash only. And they were like half of what tennis shoes normally sell for. Is anybody suspicious of something like that? Why did I just read in the paper that a truckload of Adidas tennis shoes was just stolen from a truck stop on I-70? Is that what happened? They took that big truck and they unloaded them in all of these little vans and they ran around Kansas City real fast to sell them for cash and make a ton of money and not report it to the government? So when somebody offers me something at a ridiculously low price, I'm going, I don't think I want to buy that. It's probably part of the illegal economy that's going on. It talks about Colombia profiting from drug exports, and that would be also true for drug activity in the United States. I mean, do drug dealers file a tax return and say, this is how much money I made selling drugs last year? No. In fact, how does the government catch a guy who's really good at selling drugs, but they can't catch him selling drugs? He lives in $1 million house and he drives a $300,000 car, and he shows on his tax return that he only makes $12,000 a year. What do you think the government says? We can't catch you selling drugs, but we can put you in jail for income tax evasion. Because if you live in this kind of house and drive this kind of car, you obviously make more money than you reported on your tax return, so you go to jail for a fraudulent tax return. I mean, it's not as, you don't go to jail as long for that as you do for selling drugs, but the government does that in America all the time. They take people to jail for fraudulent business dealings and not paying their taxes. No. Page 470 talks about exchange rates. Have any of you ever gone someplace where you had to take your American dollars and exchange them for a different currency? What currency?
Safa.
And what was the exchange rate?
I think 500 Safas was like $1.
It's 600 Sefa now. They changed it.
600 what?
600 Sefa. Which
600 Jaffa
Sefa.
is $1.
Yes.
What could you buy with 600 Japhas?
Sefa.
Safas, a lot.
It's
You
safe.
can buy like a couple outfits, some shoes.
A bag of rice.
With 600 of those, you could buy a pair of shoes
Pair of shoes, clothes, some fruit.
and still have money
Vegetables.
left over?
Yeah.
For $1.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's right, Anna. For $1? For $1?
Well, 50 cents, which could buy you some like vegetables and stuff, that's worth like, what, 20 cents in America?
Huh.
50
Safas
Sefas was
was like
5 cents, was it?
Now, what country was this, ladies?
Guinea-Bissau. It's the
So,
top
Anna, are
10
you going
poorest country in the
to
world.
check on what it costs to fly there
Yep.
and take a few dollars
Right now.
You actually
And
can't
exchange
fly
it?
to that country. You have to fly to the country above it.
and then get on a bus and go there and exchange your money and go shopping and then bring it all home? When I was in Brazil and I learned to sleep in a hammock and realized how comfortable it was, I decided to bring some hammocks home. One for each of our children and a couple to keep around the house. So I loaded my suitcase up with about 6 hammocks. And that's been so long ago, they've kind of worn out. So I've tried to find a place, and I bought those hammocks for like, I think it was between $12 and $15 a piece. And so I tried to buy some online, and I went to Google and went online and said, Brazilian hammocks. And they want $120 for a Brazilian hammock. I said to my wife, I think I'm going to tell my missionary friend in Brazil that on his next trip to the States, buy me a couple of hammocks and bring them home with him. And when he gets here, I will take him to Kohl's and buy him 2 pairs of dress shoes to wear when he goes visits churches here in town.
Dr. Boner,
Yes?
if you bought anything in Guinea-Bissau, you would not want to bring it back to the States because it's all the stuff that people in America cast off and
Oh, it
sent
is.
over there because it's a very, very poor country.
Oh, is that what happens to some of the stuff from Red Rack that nobody buys? They pack it up and put it in bundles
Yeah, you
and
know-
ship it to that country?
You know those like basketball shirts when they get the wrong number with the right name or whatever? Like Michael Jordan had like number like 47 or something? Yeah, that's where it goes.
That's where it goes. Okay.
I want one of those.
Have any of you been to any other countries where there's an exchange rate? Where you had to exchange American dollars for another currency? Well, some of you just need to travel a little bit and have a foreign experience.
Yeah, I wish.
Yeah, I'll let you know the next time we're
Page
there.
472 shows a picture of what? The United States and Europe and Japan. At the top of page 472, look at the United States, and then above it in brown is Canada. The size of the country on this cartogram corresponds to their total gross domestic product. So what that means is the United States has 14 times the gross domestic product of Canada. So Canada is real small and the United States is real large. And Japan, isn't that interesting? Japan, even though it's a small country, its gross domestic product is about a third of what it is in the United States. Or ours is only 3 times bigger. So where are some other countries on here? Look at how big North America is, and look how big Central and South America are. And in South America, Brazil's the biggest. In Europe, it looks like Spain and France and Italy, and Germany, Slovakia, and Germany are the biggest. And then there's some tiny little ones. And that's based on, see, when people say that's based on how rich the country is. If you want to do something about jobs going overseas, you can Google how many jobs, how many factory jobs have gone overseas, how many service sector jobs, how many software jobs. Does anyone know what oil company in America is owned by Venezuela? When you're traveling, did you ever think that you might pull into a gas station and buy gas and the profits from that gas station go to Venezuela? Would you like to know which gas station it is? Citgo, C-I-T-G-O, is owned by Venezuela. Have any of you heard anything about the problems they're having in Venezuela? Okay, guess what's happened? Venezuela is on the outs with America. So if they are not getting along with America, what country has probably befriended them?
England.
What?
England.
Pick a country that would say, if you're America's enemy, you're my friend.
North Korea.
North Korea,
Russia,
Germany.
China. All 3 of those have given aid to Venezuela. Oh, but the Russians put a condition on their aid. The Russians have sent tons of money to Venezuela, but guess what they asked to be used as collateral to guarantee that Venezuela would repay the money? The Citgo Oil Company. Which means if Venezuela defaults on the money they borrowed from Russia, Citgo, which now makes money for Venezuela, will be making money for Russia. Now, to me, that's a bit humorous, that Russia can, well, actually, that's not the only thing. Some Russian oligarchs a few years ago bought some uranium mines in America. And our government at the time approved the sale. So just remember where the money from Citgo is going. I mean, it's okay to buy it there, but just remember that the profits are going to Venezuela. Oh, what else do we have here? Page 473 talks about pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial societies. Okay, pre-industrial would be when we were farmers. On page 473, the right-hand column. Agriculture. Industrial is when many people worked in factories. And post-industrial, at the bottom of the page, would be when people, most of the people worked in service industries. The leading job categories in the United States in post-industrial society, or tertiary employment it's called, were teachers, salespeople, secretaries, typists, truck drivers, farmers, farm laborers, janitors, cleaners, waiters and waitresses, nurses, home health aides, and freight and stock handlers. Now, do you understand why they say you're living in a post-industrial age? And most of you will probably, when you go to work, will go to work in service industries, or what are called tertiary. Remember, primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary, they raise the crops, or they mine the raw material. Secondary, they turn the raw material into a useful product. And tertiary is they deliver those products around the world. A farmer raises wheat. He sells it to a bakery. A bakery makes bread, and then they have all these trucks that load up with bread and deliver it to all these stores. And we go in there and buy it. Do you have a favorite kind of bread?
Edible?
Wheat? Anybody have a favorite kind of bread?
This might sound weird, but I really like sourdough bread.
Sourdough bread?
Yes.
Health nuts. Now, why would someone make a face when I mention health nut bread? It's healthy and it has nuts in it. And it costs $3 a loaf. As opposed to what? 80 cents for a loaf of white bread. White bread. You see the look on my face? That disgusting stuff. Ooh. White bread. Why would we eat that stuff? I'm thinking that white bread is made to tear the crust off, to wad it up in tiny little round balls, and play catch with it. Wasn't intended to be eaten. Page 476 talks about measuring how each sector contributes to the gross domestic product. And it shows on page 476 this little graph, which is a cool little thing. Primary, secondary, and tertiary. In Norway, 5% of the men work in primary, 32% in secondary, and 63% in tertiary or service industries. In the United States, 2% work in primary, 20% in secondary, and 68% in tertiary.
Oh, 20% in secondary?
30% in the United States, 30%. In Honduras, for men, 51% work in primary, 20% in secondary, and 29% in tertiary, service industries. In Tanzania, 80% of the men work in primary, 4% in secondary, and 16% in tertiary. You can look that up on the internet for about any country. Let's see. Page 478 Why are some countries rich and why are some countries poor? Any ideas about what makes a rich country?
Because some countries have more economic development than others do.
Have you noticed on Canvas the discussion question I posted for this chapter? How did the United States, in less than 250 years, become one of the richest and most powerful nations on the earth? Or countries on the earth? How did that happen? If you Google that, you will see a whole bunch of people giving explanations as to why that happened. Now you can Google it and find some stuff, or you can just write it up based on what you think. Personally, I think a big part of what made us a wealthy nation is the Protestant work ethic. Have you ever heard of that? Have any of you ever heard of the Protestant work ethic? What does the Bible say about how you're supposed to work at your job?
To the best of your ability.
Do your work as unto the Lord. And the Ten Commandments would say, you don't steal from your employer. You don't lie to your employer. You follow me? So the Protestant work ethic promoted honest, hard work in America that built a wealthy nation. And how is it we became so powerful? Well, when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq and all their oil wells were taken over, and Kuwait called America and said, "Can you help us?" We said, "Yes, we'll be right there." And we went to Kuwait and drove the Iraqi army back into Iraq and gave them their oil fields back, and then loaded up and came home and said, well, we're done with helping that part of the world solve a problem. Does anyone know another place in the world where they cried out for help and we packed up and went to help them?
England?
England asked for help when, who were they threatened by?
Germany.
Germany. And what did we do? We not only helped England, we helped France and helped set them free from German occupation. So we basically, how did we get to be such a powerful country? Have any of you ever seen an army jeep? Have any of you ever seen a jeep? Okay, but you've never seen an old army jeep. When you drive off campus, have you ever noticed those?
They're Hummers.
Those little Hummers sitting out there? Okay, do you realize when Germany was taking over Europe, like that video we saw last week, when Germany was taking over Europe and Europe asked us for help, we turned all of our automobile factories into factories to make military machinery. And we produced a huge amount of military armament and put it on ships and sent it over there to help fight the war against Germany. Or I should say not against Germany, but against Hitler and his army. Because I don't think all the German people were in favor of what he was doing. You don't blame everybody for that, for what he did to that country and to the countries around there. But, and one of those automobile factories made Jeeps that they used in the Army, and after the war was over, people wanted to buy them. You could buy Army surplus Jeeps, but then they kept making them, and that's where the Jeep came from. That's become what you know as a Jeep Wrangler, I think it is now, or something. So why are we rich? Well, if you look at the internet, it'll say, well, we have a lot of things going for us. First, we're a big country with huge amounts of natural resources. And plus, we're not susceptible to being invaded like France was, or like Germany was, or like Ukraine was, because we've got an ocean on both sides, and friendly countries on the north and the south. And plus, it says, all these Europeans who immigrated here for a better life basically said, there's no future for us in Europe, but if we go to America, we can homestead 160 acres and we can have our own little place. And the whole idea, I know somebody made the comment when I told them about how they were surprised that the 5 civilized tribes applied to make Oklahoma a state and call it Sequoia, but they made the comment that it is pretty tragic how the European immigrants that came to America mistreated the Native Americans who lived here. And there's no avoiding that. I mean, there's no question. You can't diminish or take away, as much as we all have European heritage, you can't diminish or take away the pain that was caused to Native Americans and to African Americans who were brought here as slaves. It's just wrong. And I'll take those two groups as the largest. The next would be the way Catholics were treated when they first immigrated to America by Protestant Americans was not very Christian. And guess what the rationale was? Well, the Catholic Church isn't acting very Christian toward our Protestant brothers in Europe, so why should we be Christian toward our Catholic brothers in America? Because the Bible tells us to. On page 478, right-hand column, bottom of the page, many of today's poor countries still export only unprocessed raw materials or materials with little value added, such as agricultural goods, basic metals, or textiles. In other words, the poor country is selling off their raw material to wealthier countries who take the raw material and make something out of it that they can sell to the rest of the world, that's usable to the rest of the world. It talks about those that export oil. OPEC have tried to form cartels. And I think it's fair to say this, that while the OPEC countries try to form cartels, the United States tries to keep the cartels divided so we get to buy oil from these countries cheaper than we would otherwise. On page 480, it talks about coffee cartels. The Association of Coffee Producing Countries tries to keep the price of coffee high, but the members of coffee producing countries have not been able to cooperate as a united group. So every now and then, it's this old supply and demand. They produce too much coffee and the price collapses, and then people quit raising coffee, and then the price goes up, so they plant it again, and it's just back and forth and back and forth. Have all of you heard about the Dust Bowl that blew away part of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas? Does anyone know why that happened?
Partially.
Somebody decided that they could take all that grassland out there and plow up the grass and turn it into farmland to raise wheat. It's like, why would you do that? This grassland is a perfect place to raise cattle because there's a wheat shortage around the world and the price of wheat is sky high, so let's raise wheat and sell it to Europe and sell it to Russia and sell it to China, sell it to Asia, sell it wherever they're buying wheat. So a whole bunch of people plowed up all that grassland, and sure enough, the first year they made a bunch of money, the second year they made a bunch of money, the third year they had a drought, and the wind started blowing, and it blew all the dirt from their cropland away, And the only guy who didn't lose his land was the guy who left it in grass and kept raising cattle. And who told him that, hey guys, you know, pretty soon the wheat market is going to get saturated. There's going to be too much wheat and the price is going to collapse. And sure enough, it did. And then the drought came and everybody paid. They've fixed it because they've learned how to farm differently and take better care of the land. On page 480, it says in the right-hand column, about 90% of global oil and gas resources are owned by wholly or partially government-owned entities, as in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Qatar, and Kuwait. Did you just read in the news about an aircraft carrier and a bunch of battleships are headed toward Iran? Because Iran is making threats toward Americans in the Middle East. Why would Iran threaten America? Because America is telling people, if you buy oil from Iran, you can't do business with us. We've put a sanction on Iran. And so that's going to mess up Iran's economy, so they're going to threaten to attack us. Page 481 says, left-hand column, Norway is practically the only oil exporting nation to have achieved balanced economic growth. When Norway first pumped crude oil from the North Sea in 1975, it had the advantages of being a stable democracy with honest civil servants. Did you catch that? A stable democracy with honest civil servants, a well-established legal system, and a large middle class. So some people conclude those three things: a stable democracy, honest civil servants, a well-established legal system, and a large middle class. I just read that the president tweeted that his term as president should be extended 2 more years.
He's been doing such a great job.
You guys have to understand, the president's from New York City. Do you know people from New York City? They make outlandish statements all the time.
Wait, are we talking about Norway or America?
America. The American president just said his term of office ought to be extended 2 more years because of all the time that's been spent trying to derail his presidency by Congress. So can he just decide to serve for 2 more years?
No.
No, because of what? An established legal system. So why does he even talk about it? I think people from New York City just like to gouge the rest of the world. A few years ago, people in New York City were telling us that we should turn the Great Plains of America back into a buffalo nature park. Tell all the people who live in the Great Plains that they have to move out and turn the Great Plains back into a buffalo reserve. Well, guess what I think they ought to do with New York City? Tear it down and turn it back into the nature reserve that it was before they built New York City. See, they don't really mean stuff like that. They just say stuff like that to see if they can get us going. So just turn around and say it back to them. Some of those people in Washington haven't figured that out. You extend your presidency 2 more years and we'll extend our term of office for 2 more years, and all of us will spend another 2 years just fighting each other and accomplishing little or nothing for the country. So much for a stable democracy. Maybe it's stable, it's just not very productive. And honest civil servants, you know what? There's some stuff going on in America that says some civil servants are not as honest as they used to be or as they should be. a well-established legal system, and a large middle class. What makes the middle class being large so important? Middle class people not only earn the money, but they do the work to earn the money, and they spend the money to buy things. Nevertheless, oil wealth at first seduced Norwegians. The natural welfare system was expanded. The national welfare system was expanded, and the work week declined. In the 1990s, however, Norway segregated the oil business and diversified the rest of the economy, and the government set up the Petroleum Fund to finance Norwegian retirements. That's how Norway pays for some of their social programs they have going on. Some people have said we should follow the Norwegian health care plan. I checked it out to see how much it costs. It's very expensive. And I asked how Norway pays for it. Oh, I found out. They have all the petroleum money goes directly to the government to pay for the health care. What would that mean in America? All the petroleum producing companies would be taken over by the government. Would that bother anybody in this room? Do any of you have friends who work in the oil industry? That would bother you, wouldn't it? That they took it over so they could use the proceeds from the oil to pay for the social programs that they want to set in place for retirement, as well as to finance their health care. Oh, and by the way, if you make over $1 million a year in income, your taxes are 70% of your income in Norway. How many millionaires would go for paying $700,000 of their $1 million income in taxes? I don't think any of them would go for that. All the people who say we ought to follow the Norwegian pattern probably need to do a little reading about the history of Norway. And here's one little paragraph on page 481 that gives you a glimpse of what's going on. And I have to say, I don't think any of the people who are talking to us about borrowing ideas from Norway are talking about borrowing Norway's economic approach to solving the problems. There is no free lunch. There is no free health care. There is no free retirement. Everything has to be paid for by somebody. What's so hard about that concept? When you go to work and get a paycheck, have you ever looked at your paycheck to see where it says FICA? F-I-C-A? Well, all I can say is thank you very much. That's the money they take out of your paycheck that they send to me every month in my Social Security check. And I just say thank you for making my life more comfortable.
Well, you're very welcome.
And someday, when you get old, you can thank the younger generation for paying for your Social Security benefit. Have you heard this? By the time you're old enough to retire, Social Security won't be there. Have you heard that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The people who are saying that are people in Washington who don't live on Social Security. Did you know that? I was shocked when I learned that elected officials in the United States government have their own retirement program. They're not on Social Security like the rest of us. You know what would happen? If they were on Social Security would stay solvent. They just simply treat themselves to a different kind of program. Same with health care. Government employees have a whole different health care system than the rest of us have. And I'm thinking, I thought the spirit of America was that you go to Washington and you pass laws that you're willing to live with when you go back home and become a private citizen. Well, no, not anymore, because we've decided to make being a politician our livelihood. And in the process of doing that, We think it's best to have our own retirement program and our own health care program. And by the way, a few years ago, when they were talking about minimum wage, because all the businesses in America ought to be paying minimum wage, guess who was exempt from minimum wage payments? Government employees who work for the senators and elected officials in Washington. I'm telling you, that is just wrong, folks. That is just wrong. Well, page 482, right-hand column. The automobile industry is an example of an industry that brings together a number of previously manufactured parts and assembles them into a more complex product. Have you heard people say that Toyotas are now made in America? Toyota builds their trucks in Texas. They have a plant in Alabama. Yeah, but guess where they get the parts that they put in the truck in Texas and in the car that's built in Alabama? Where do you think the Toyota parts come from? Anyone know the home of Toyota?
Is it
Japan.
Japan?
It comes from Japan. They ship the parts over here and put them together, so now we can say it's made in America. Does anyone know why we started buying cars from Japan instead of buying them from Detroit?
Because they
Cheaper.
make better quality.
What'd you say?
Cheaper.
And what'd you say?
Better quality.
Both. Both. You could buy a Japanese car cheaper than an American-made car. And the American-made car was almost programmed to break down in 3 years, 2 or 3 years. And the Japanese car was programmed to go for 10 years. It was built to last longer. That's also true of Volkswagen. Anyone know where that came from? Toyotas came from Japan. Where did Volkswagens come from?
Germany?
Volkswagen?
Germany.
Oh yeah.
And it's the same thing there. The Germans made a better car, better quality, that you could buy cheaper. I told you the story about buying my first Volkswagen and going to Oklahoma, and all of my family down there came out and made fun of it and laughed at it. One uncle said, "Don't park that thing at my house. I don't want you parking a German-made car at my house," and he went all ballistic about it. But why did I buy it? Because it was cheaper than any American-made car, and it was more dependable. So what's happened in America? Detroit has lost a major part of their population because the auto industry dried up in Detroit. We still have the auto industry going in Kansas City, but where are they making those Fords and Chevrolets now? In other places other than Detroit. Let's see, page 485. The Caribbean Basin on page 485, right-hand column, top of the page. Offer cheap labor and U.S. tax advantages. These advantages were granted under a U.S. government program, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, that was designed to help these countries industrialize. So does this surprise you that goods and services that used to be made in the United States are now being shipped and produced in the Caribbean countries? Because it's giving those people a job and it's helping their economy. But, page 485, manufacturing in the United States, no other country matches America's total manufacturing output of $2.28 trillion in the United States. However, the share of the labor force in manufacturing and the sector's contribution to GDP have been falling from 25% of jobs to 9% of jobs. If we're still a huge manufacturing country, how come we're using fewer workers to manufacture stuff?
It's technology.
Have any of you ever toured one of the plants, automobile plants, the places where they make automobiles? Okay, at one time, every job was done by a person sitting at a station with a machine. Now, what do we call them? Robots? Technology. Robotics replaces all of that. Are you aware of what robotics can do? My grandson, who's a sophomore in high school, had a project in his Bible class to make something, and he decided he was going to make a miniature Ark of the Covenant that's about this long, this wide, and this tall, with 2 huge cherubim holding their wings out across the top of it. He goes to Johnson County Public Library and takes a big roll of plastic. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Have any of you done that with one of those printers where you put your roll of plastic in there and it takes the picture of what you want to make and it creates it in 3 dimensions, and then it just goes around and around and around burning plastic until it builds the whole thing? It's amazing. He brought that home and I'm going, whoa! It took about 10 or 12 hours for the machine to make it, but it's robotics, it's technology. The stuff that can be done out there. I just read something the other day that said they've got a machine that'll build a house now. They take it out to a location, they set the machine up, they hook it up to the supply of plastic, and just starts going in a circle and building a house. And when they're finished, at the end of the day, the house is done and they're ready to move the machinery on to another place and make another one. This robotic stuff is unbelievable. Does it surprise anybody? The place where they used to have a lot of human sickness was in the rooms where they painted cars. So if you ever go tour one of those places, why isn't there a guy inside holding the nozzle to paint cars? It's too much of a health hazard. We've got him behind a big screen in an air-conditioned booth running robotics that do all the work that people used to do inside. Okay. I guess the economy in Japan is where we'll start on Wednesday on page 486. You know anything about the Japanese economy? Thank you for writing such interesting papers. I've enjoyed reading them. Don't forget to go to Canvas, click on discussions, and answer those questions. It's part of your reading assignment.